Okay, ladies and gentlemen, councillors and staff, this is my opportunity as Deputy Chair of the Policy Committee to get into the hot seat. I'll be here for about 30 seconds. I just need to open the meeting and we're going to adjourn because the Chairman is running a wee bit late. He shouldn't be long. So the meeting is now opened and also adjourned. Thank you.
colleagues. Firstly, apologies from myself for the delay. I've received apologies from Councillor Brown for lateness. I've received apologies from Mayor Brownless and Councillor Clout, who are on other council business. Can I please have a mover to accept those apologies? Moved by Councillor Mason, seconded by Councillor Stewart. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. There is no public forum. There are no late items. There is no confidential business to be transferred into the open. Change to the order of business. My understanding is that one of the papers has been withdrawn. Christine, would you be able to speak to that?
So I can speak to that. So you'll see in the recovering report there were some recommendations from staff. We still need to have some further conversations with some of those matters with Tangata Whenua, and in talking to them about the report, it was agreed that we were better to have a engagement between elected members and Tangata Whenua, have a further hui. So on that basis, we suggest that that report not be considered at this meeting.
Thank you for that, Christine. Are there any declarations of conflict of interest? There being none, if I can very briefly, it's not my practice to give a chairperson's report usually, but given that it's our first meeting since the terrorist attacks in Christchurch on Friday, I want to briefly outline what's going to happen today. At 1 o'clock we've got a council meeting and Mayor Brownless is going to address that matter, and there will be a moment of silence and reflection, and I think that it is appropriate that that's done at the council level rather than the committee level. That being said, just for the record, you know, we've had 50 fellow Kiwis who were stolen from us in a cowardly terrorist attack, and they're forever going to be our mums and dads, brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. And as the Prime Minister said, and I think that all right-thinking New Zealanders would agree, that they were all of us. And then that begs the question, how should we respond to terror? And in my view, to discourage further attacks, we have to highly resolve to act in the exact opposite spirit to the way that terrorists want, and to overcome evil by doing good, and to make the most of every opportunity to do so. We need to be fanatics in terms of loving each other and members of our community, and we need to embrace both Muslims and migrants in our community. I was really impressed this week when I saw members of the Papamoa community via Facebook offering to walk alongside any Muslim that feared going out in public. I thought that was such a great show of our community's character. And while the shedding of innocent blood here is a mark on our country's name, and it's hard to watch international news and see our beloved New Zealand associated with such brutality, let's not allow the crime to define us as a country, but rather let's be an example to the world by how we respond when a savage tries to divide us as a united people. Who are we as a people and as a nation? I think the second verse of our national anthem tells us very clearly who we are. It says, "Men of every creed and race gather here before thy face, asking thee to bless this place, God to friend our free land, from dissension, envy, hate, corruption without our state. New Zealand," and I think we all look forward to fulfilling those words. That is the end of my chairperson's report. As we move into business, we have DC20, which is the deliberations on both the water supply bylaw and the draft meter and large water users policy. We've got Pia Bars and Jane Barnett from the staff who are going to present to this item, which is on page 6 of your agenda.
our responsibilities for managing water meters into a separate policy distinct from the bylaw. So we did that, and we've made a few changes. I guess the key changes we talked about when we approved it, but just to recap, was identifying all the circumstances where council approval was required. I guess we see this as a fundamental first line of defence in protecting both the network and the supply of water. That, you know, basically nothing can be done to the supply network without council's approval. So that we also, the other kind of key change was revising and clarifying definitions for point of supply. And we've called it, point of supply and points of responsibility. We sort of found in the past that, you know, we just need to clarify where a customer is responsible for any water leaks or any management and protection of infrastructure, and where council's responsibility lies. And it's just obviously having that transparency helps with maintaining and protecting the network. So they're probably the two key changes in terms of the bylaw. Mostly it was just clarifying and making it readable so we can set out those rules. But at the same time, since we were consulting on water, it provided an opportunity to also go out and talk to our community about water allocation and large water users. So we created a policy earlier in the year, but just consulted on at the same time, and that's the large water users policy. I'm going to just hand over to Peter to talk about sort of the motivation and what that policy does.
Thanks, Jane. Before I touch on the large water policy, I think the other fundamental change that occurred since the last bylaw was adopted was the Health Drinking Water Amendment Act. So there was water safety plans were a legislative requirement which weren't in force at the time. So we've just beefed up on some of the issues surrounding security of supply and backflow prevention as well. The large water user policy has been driven primarily out of the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. That's driven Regional Council to introduce Plan Change 9, which scrutinizes water allocation from all the streams in the area. The early indications are that the streams are over-allocated, and as a result they looking at ways of recouping some of that allocation. We as a municipal supplier, under the Plan Change 9 requirements, are required to produce a water management plan, and that requires us to demonstrate water efficiency and how we can reduce the amount of water that by existing users, and any other ways of trying to manage our water supply better in a growing environment, of course. So the large water user policy actually forms part of the draft water management plan, and that was brought to council in February of last year. So that was tabled at the time, and it was opportune to take this policy out for public consultation at the same time as the water bylaw. So that's a brief background to the driver.
Thank you, Peter. Just to put the allocation in some context, what percentage of the flows are allocated?
So what was introduced by the Regional Council was a fairly blunt tool to do the allocation, which was really a conservative approach, and it was the 10% of the 7-day low flow average. I might not have all the detailed definition of that, but effectively the lowest portion of time of river flow, and they take 10% of that, and that becomes allocable water for users. And the indication is that our existing streams are fairly oversubscribed.
question, but we have a document tabled in front of us, Mr. Chairman, that is a recommended addition to the policy and some comment around that in regard to water for dust suppression and so on. So at the right time, if you could allow Jane and Peter to address that, and then we can see if we adopt it.
Mr. Chairman. Peter, could you perhaps give us a little bit more detail around the water usage? You said it was a sort of fairly oversubscribed. Is it 10, 20, 30%? Can you give us some sort of quantum?
On our existing supplies, it's fairly significant. I haven't got the exact percentage at present. When we were consented for the Waiari supply, so if you take 10% is what Regional Council are using, our full allocation represents about 18 to 20% of that flow. So roughly double what the Regional Council are proposing. So even our most recent consent could be under review.
Any further questions on the report so far? Jane, would you mind addressing the tabled item option 2 in red, which we have in front of us?
Sure. I might just backtrack a little bit. All the resolutions we're seeking is adoption of the water meter policy, which is in attachment A, and there was just we responded to submitters and we've made a few changes, and that's attachment A that we're seeking adoption of. And then also the large water user policy, which is attachment B, and this here is just, we've tabled an item because on reflection, looking at that policy, we felt that we needed to clarify where water use for development and construction sat. So all we've done is on that table item, we've said about option 2 we're now recommending, and we've also highlighted sort of where in the table that we're making that change. So we're just wanting, because on table 1 of the policy, which is on page 37, we've got the medium priority, and we've just got the word industrial, and we just wanted to add some words after that to explain and to sort of clarify that development and construction is included in that medium category.
Thank you for that, Jane.
Yep.
What I propose to do, colleagues, is if we go through if we address the submissions page by page, and if there are any things that members wish to raise in relation to those submissions while we are considering them, please do so. So if we look at page 9 of our agenda, the recommendations are no change required, but is there anything on page 9 you wish to address? No. Page 10. And by the way, I'm assuming that if there's nothing you wish to address on page 10 that we're agreeing with the staff recommendation. Page 11. Page 12. Page 13, which is dust suppression. This is really, Jane, question from me. Option 2, does that go of issue 8 land development and water allocation policy? Does this address the submissions in regard to dust suppression? The proposed amendment, does that address that submission specifically?
I think that submission, I guess, in summary, and you can see the summary there, was that they do not agree that land development has not been included in a high priority. And, as a high priority, we've only got one use, and that's water and sanitation. There's nothing else, whereas mostly everything else fits in that medium category. So we haven't made a recommendation to change that because we feel that based on allocation, the utmost importance is that health and sanitation. So we haven't made a recommendation to do that, but we have taken on board that submission in the sense that, it can be hard to see where that water use fits, and so we have, on reflection, added it.
Councillor Baldock, you had some questions and concerns around that submission. Has the proposed amendment addressed those?
Yeah, I think the amendment, although I might ask about putting in the word including land development and construction, just to make it clear what kind of development we're talking about. But yes, I think it does go some way to reassuring that it's specifically included in the medium priorities. And I think that's the right place. I think if we were running out of water and we didn't have anything to drink, we would probably drink water before we would pour it on the dust. So it's right to keep that priority in the way it is. But there is also another amendment that may come, which is simply to say that staff, we will request staff to work with, to do some investigation and work with developers to identify other sources of water, particularly in the dry season, because that's when we're going to run into these, and we're likely to run into these dry seasons until Waiari comes online. So we don't want any land development held up because of it if we can. So being more proactive in the whole process, I think.
Excuse me, following on from Councillor Baldock, in terms of a suggested amendment later, could we, if we potentially added some reference to working alongside the regional council in terms of the over-allocation, because the regional council must understand the urgency of our housing situation and accommodate that in terms of allowing for additional take from those flows, or do you think it wouldn't entertain such a consideration? Do you think it would be helpful if we added those words to work with the regional council?
Yeah, we have actually got that resolution, and we could add to that.
Could that be brought up on the screen so colleagues can consider it while we're going through? Okay, colleagues, moving now to issue 4 and 5 on page 14. Page 15, page 16, page 15, Councillor Granger.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Peter. It's my favourite subject, as you know. Just in regards to new houses, the possibility of including rainwater tanks, etc., certainly promoting the addition of rainwater tanks on existing houses. I see that the note there as regards to the council has undertaken a study on the benefits, etc. Can you just give us a bit of an update, because I see at the end of it all there's no change required. What I was probably searching for there is why not the possibility of making some of these mandatory on new homes?
This part was a submission to the bylaw, and the purpose of the bylaw was to sort of protect. It was just whether it was the appropriate place to do that, because the bylaw is looking at protecting the water supply and the network, and whereas I guess this year is looking at efficiency, not the protection. So the bylaw I would recommend would be not the most appropriate place. Yeah.
Christine.
And just through the chair, so we did report this to the Environment Committee last year, and the overall conclusions of that in terms of water, that water tanks would not get the benefits that you were looking at. And remember, we talked about some of the work that had been done in Auckland, where they came to the same conclusions. So at the conclusion of that piece of work, you asked us to proceed with this guideline work, and that's now what's happening and is underway. But certainly we were unable to provide a case that made sense in terms of mandatory tanks for new dwellings.
Will that come back to us, and if so, when?
Guidelines come back to you for information. Is that what you're asking, John? Steve's nodding, so yes.
Just a question, and in support of what Councillor Granger's saying, but perhaps an earlier step before we have mandatory water tanks. If you think about it, the biggest cost to installing a water tank, particularly the ones that sit underneath the eaves and so on and can be utilised is the plumbing within the house. And at some point, I think we should look at, in terms of the building act or code or our own plan, you know, if you take the time when you're building the house to simply put in a T-junction on your toilets and, you know, and your washing machine supply, you can then easily in the future, at any time, voluntarily or mandatorily, whatever the climate's doing, you can install water tanks and they can then flush your toilets and so on. But if you've got to go through and retrofit, you're going to have quite a bit of cost. So it's something maybe staff could, you know, at some point look into, this being the first step.
Page 16, page 17, 18, 21, 22, 23, and 24. Okay, those submissions being considered, is somebody prepared to move the list of recommendations we have, which includes an additional E to address Councillor Baldock's point? In fact, I'll invite Councillor Baldock, if he wishes, to move those series of resolutions because of his work there. Would you be prepared to do so?
I would, but if I could just request, just in brief discussion with Jane and Peter before the meeting, if we could just amend that wording to say request staff to work with, to investigate and work with the development community, so that there is a bit more onus on us leading in that and working with them. And if that would be acceptable, then I'd certainly be happy to move. Yeah, I think we are living in an age, of course, where we have to take very good care of our water supply. It's you know, it's critical for life, and we have balancing and competing interests for it. So we've got to respond to the regional council's requirements under legislation that we allocate things efficiently and so on. My concern just going through the submission process was that we did realise too that we have a crisis in our city of land supply, and particularly in the next 3 years until we see the larger developments coming online and Waiari coming online, there may be smaller developable pieces of land, and we know this is our second year of water restrictions, so we want to make sure that they are not held up simply because of particularly a low level of restriction as we had in the last 2 years. And we need to do everything we can to find alternative supplies for dust suppression, and as was explained to us by developers, they need water for compression too when they are preparing ground for housing development. So you know, we think, oh well, they should just go and pump the water out of a stormwater pond, but sometimes in the dry season, of course, the stormwater pond can be dry, and if we simply just send the message that we are working with them, we understand the need, and we can try and identify whatever sources there may be. And in the future, when we have large, like Tauriko and Te Tumu, we may have to see sources of water set up that they must contribute to having tanks and supply and so on to address it, because we must bring land online for housing in the city.
I fully support it, but I would like to add some words to that amendment, as I indicated before, around working with the regional council to ask if it can consider increasing its allowance to accommodate further land development. So look, I've just scribbled down some words, if you can sort of bear with me. I don't want this to appear to be an ill-considered amendment. To the amendment by E, that's correct. And at the end of it, add the words, and work with the regional council to seek an increase in its allowance to support land development. that's due to the critical nature of the sub-region's housing crisis.
I'd just like to ask Jane and Peter if they're comfortable with that or if they have any suggestion. I think the intent is fine.
I think the content is, we've got regional council involved because we were concerned going into this summer in terms of water allocation for dust suppression. I think it's really a case of working with regional council to ensure that we have access to alternative sources like stormwater ponds, and it's not seen as part of the environmental allocation. So it's working through that as a process. It's not so much a water allocation issue because we still have to work within our existing allocation. It's more about working with regional council to find good solutions to alternative sources would be my suggestion.
Through the chair, could I suggest maybe a solution would be just to modify slightly, go back to what we had before, but go request staff to investigate and work with both the regional council and the development community to identify non-potable supply for dust suppression. So that would broaden the range of opportunities, because the allocation issue is really around how much the water source can bear, and so that's really not related to the ultimate use. It's about allocating that. So I think it's really about how we find ways to identify non-potable uses or sources that could be applied to the land and work together with regional council, including changes that they may need to make to their air, land and water plan, and we have commenced those discussions with them already.
Yes, excuse me, I understand that, but I lack understanding of where the 10% of the lowest flow comes from. I would guess that anything more than 10% would have a material impact on the natural environment there downstream of where the take is. So a few fish might find it difficult to breed or whatever it might do. But that's why I'd like to include some consideration of increasing its allowance, if by even allowing for double the flow in that summertime period, if it has a less than minor impact on the natural environment, then I would like the regional council to consider increasing its allocation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The longer game is the Plan Change 9 that Christine's been talking about. In fact, what Peter referred to earlier with the Waiari, we used a different method of assessing the allocable flow, and we got a consent on that basis. It's quite different to the blunt instrument as Peter's described it, which is just a straight percentage, which was the first sort of tranche of checks that the regional council has done across all the surface water. We've submitted on the plan change, and we've asked for a different approach where we're looking at all the environmental and cultural aspects of the stream to see what is an acceptable minimum low flow, and not just a straight percentage on a hydrological, calculation. So that process is still underway, and the submissions are being heard in the next number of months, and regional council are working through that. So we have injected that thinking into their processes for the longer term, but that will go through a very long process still.
I would just reinforce that. I think the issue of water allocation is a complex issue related to national standards, etc., and national policy statements, and I think by trying to pick up the dust suppression issue within that is you're picking only a minor part. So I think if you want to have those conversations with the regional council, they should be had at a whole of water allocation for all uses and the sustainability of the allocation on the water sources rather than picking it up as solely a dust suppression, because I think that will land you having the wrong types of conversations with the regional council in the bigger picture.
Okay, I have Councillor.
No, we're not debating this at the moment. A comment that water is a precious commodity, and it's going to become even more precious, and it's already we're already under stress in a lot of areas. We can't take any more from Pais Pa or Oropi. We're looking at the Waiari. It's been through a thorough and a comprehensive program to come at to develop the resource consent, including consultation and working with the tangata whenua. So we can't just change it on the hoof, I don't believe. But I certainly would support the initial part of that move, that we look for other sources of water, because that's going to be absolutely critical going forward into the future, that we do that. So yeah, that's where I'm sitting at the moment.
Thank you. Councillor Robson, are you addressing E or the substantive motion?
Addressing E. I think we're confusing two things here. We're discussing our policy. The allocation issue is not actually our policy. It actually sits with another body, and I think we're conflating two issues, and that sort of obscures really, and we're getting outside our remit effectively. Just for clarification, with regard to option 2, are we replacing the word, this was the revised staff recommendation, are we replacing the word "the" with the word "land" as was previously mentioned? Can I take that as read?
So that's in terms of option 2, it says add, include.
No, that was the option 2 with regard to the table amended staff recommendation. Are we replacing the word "the" in there with the word "land"? So it's land development and and getting rid of the word "the." Okay, I just wanted to check that had taken place. Yeah.
So Baldock was still talking about E. Yep.
Yeah, I'm happy to adopt the amendment as per Christine Jones. It's up there, that we simply work with the Regional Council. I think anything further is a bit too complicated. But
are you happy, Councillor Curate, given that you've seconded that, to take that advice on board and to accept that? Okay, good, it's gold. Okay, that's not an amendment. That's part of the substantive motion. We're debating the substantive motion. Councillor Granger.
You had just a question through the chair to the staff. Steve, just in regards to to identify non-potable water, and no doubt this has been asked to before, right? Excuse me, salt water. Have you looked seriously at salt water, and if so, the reasons for not using it?
No, well, we haven't been part of looking at that. I think we've left it to the developers to look at what sources they require. But yeah, I mean, we have used other water in other applications, not dust suppression, but we've got, as you probably know, we've got the transfer main, which is treated effluent, that's available for high flows at times of emergency for dousing fire. That infrastructure is available and in place, but that's an emergency for the city. But in terms of dust suppression, no, we haven't, and a lot of it is about where the land development's occurring and in relation to the sources and the infrastructure that's in place.
That, as you know, Tauranga, the way it's situated, there's water, salt water everywhere, and I just wondered if it had been noted and perhaps looked at seriously of the possibility of using it.
Are there any further speakers to the motion? Councillor Stewart.
Thank you, through the chair. I'd just like to thank the people who made the submissions to the policy, and also just to highlight there was concern from the submitters regarding the potential of losing the large use of water, and just to confirm that the policy currently only applies to new large water applicants. So that was one of the major concerns that was raised during that process. And also just to support Councillors Baldock and Granger on their comments regarding rainwater tanks.
Speaking to it myself, yeah, no, I echo Councillor Stewart's comments around some of the concerns that were raised through submissions from existing users. This is dealing with new applications for large water use. In terms of the development, land development issue, that's a real tricky one because we know that there is a limited season for doing earthworks, and that season coincides with, as as we know, the next few years water restrictions, and there can be some concern in the community as to why somebody has to restrict their water use on their residential section for watering their plants, but a developer is taking a water cart out there and doing dust suppression. But then, by equal token, nobody, having grown up in Papamoa and witnessing the construction of Royal Palm Beach Estate before substantive water suppression, nobody wants an absolute dust storm blowing through their community as well. So is there a right of reply from you, Councillor Baldock?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I mean, it's important to note that the policy is not a prohibition on using water for dust suppression. It's simply saying without permission, and in getting that permission we have to demonstrate, or the developers have to demonstrate, that they have investigated all the options, which is what we want staff to be proactive about in this year now, preparing for next year's potential dry season. And the amendment that Councillor Carrack has raised to bring in discussions with Regional Council is useful, because it is sometimes the case, and I don't want to appear other than green here, but sometimes we have a stormwater pond developed, and then all of a sudden it becomes an inhabitation for little creatures, and we suddenly can't touch it. And I think in circumstances of a dry period, we ought to have some leeway there to make use of that resource where possible. If salt water can be used, as Councillor Granger has raised, well, we should investigate it. I wonder, though, if too much salt, because the water will evaporate, but the salt will end up getting into things. We may not want salt in our stormwater, in our, whatever. But if it can be used, it's a potential source, perhaps.
Yeah, I'll now put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. And those against? There is an abstention from Councillor Brown. Otherwise, that motion, I declare it carried. Okay, colleagues, moving now to the policy and bylaw program. Jeremy Bowes is going to present to us from staff on this item, which can be found on page 53 of your agenda.
And we'll present very briefly. Recognising the newness of the policy committee, I thought the first thing we would do would have a little stock take as to where we're at on policies and bylaws, partly to help ourselves and partly to help yourselves. What it does show is that there's quite a lot of work coming towards the end of various work streams. The 7th of May meeting is potentially quite a busy one. Within that, though, there's under the item 6 there, obviously land acquisitions and disposals. That may come back into the 7th of May as well. It may not, depending on the conversations you heard about this morning. And the local elections policy in item 6, we're working at the moment to try and get that off the policy committee agenda on the 7th of May and take it direct to council instead, as part of a sort of pre-election package of things which need to happen. So I think it's going to the 16th of April council meeting instead. But other than that, that's what we've got. In future, and also on that 7th of May meeting, what I intend to do is to bring you a list of the potential things which could start. You've got a list of the things here which are in train, but I'd like to bring a list of potential policy bylaw plan type work which could start. We'll bring you a recommendation as to what we think should start next and why, and then ask the committee to critique that and either go with it or change it. In the past, we've done that on approximately 6-monthly basis. It's worked fairly well. It means the elected members are up to speed with what's coming in the chain of work and have the opportunity to influence it in a balanced way, as opposed to just somebody popping their head up every now and again and saying we need a policy on that, we need to amend that. We try and do it that 6-monthly, which helps you with your workload and helps the staff with their workload. That's the brief presentation.
Thank you. Noting that this is just us noting Jeremy's report, and that there will be a prioritisation meeting later in April. So, colleagues, any questions from Jeremy? Councillor Baldock.
Thanks, Jeremy. I know you'll bring the list back then, but do we have any indication if tree policy is being reviewed? Because we have discussed it on a number of occasions in this triennium. wonder if we will get to it before the end of this triennium.
It's not on my list, but it can be.
I don't know if we need a motion, I think, but I would certainly like to ask that it be on the list, because in particular around the notable trees register and the way that that impacts on communities. We've had an email just recently from people in Bethlehem who have enormous trees, you know, hanging over their houses, and I've never, it comes here to council, you know, in earlier trienniums we used to have them coming all the time, and we tried to sort that out, but we still have this problem in our city where I don't believe our community are getting a fair go when it comes to these very large notable trees on private property, impacting on them and the costs they have to go through and the barriers there, and I believe it's something we do need to address. We don't want to get back into the old way of, you know, them coming here all the time, but at the moment there's no other way for them to seek really justice and fairness in it.
The notable, certainly the wider tree issue is something that we can discuss at committee on the 7th of April, May, when it comes back to us, or you can deal with it by resolution, amendment to the resolution. In terms of the notable tree issue, that's a city plan RMA issue, which of course, as you know, sits outside the policy review process, but yeah.
I may though, the issue with the notable trees and the RMA process is, it is a process, but the decision about who pays is the issue. That is a policy issue. I believe when we have trees on the notable register, they are a public good. When work needs to be done on them at the request of the residents around them, it should be something paid for by all ratepayers. And we need, without changing that policy, we can't seem to make much progress there.
Thank you for that clarification. Councillor Curak, were you indicating you had a question?
Related to the tree issue, if that's not finished.
We're dealing with questions at the moment? Is
Jeremy?
question? Yep.
Jeremy, just for public information, given this is the first policy committee meeting, and previously we've had policy and strategy committees, so where would strategy decisions go that aren't related to urban form or transport? How are they going to be handled?
Depending on the circumstances, but this committee will be the next logical place for that to happen. If it's not going to the Urban Form and Transport Development Committee, this will be the place to come.
Just come back to the notable trees. I thought, you know, some years ago we actually wrestled with this one, and the notable trees, I thought it was agreed that notable trees, the costs of pruning, managing, looking after would be borne by council. I thought that was already in place. Was it?
Got a recollection that's in some circumstances, and also where people were perhaps elderly and unable to do the maintenance. So we did things like cleaning gutters and those types of things where the notable trees were impacting on people's enjoyment of their homes or maintenance of their homes. And there was also some discussion at one point in time about a partial contribution to the resource consent costs, where people were having to get a resource consent for pruning and other activities. But it sounds like it's worth a re-look at that, and so that's absolutely something that we can do.
I absolutely agree that a notable tree that's there for community good shouldn't be at any expense to the homeowner to manage that and look after it, and so it stays in a suitable condition for the position that it's in. The other question I'd like to ask is, we got a couple of bylaws here: the freedom and camping bylaw and prostitution bylaw. How do we enforce those bylaws? How can we ensure that at the end of the day we can enforce them, and two, that it's carried right through to enforcement?
So, I mean, the first thing is around having resources to be out on the ground to actually go and speak to people who are likely to be at freedom campings or carrying out some sort of prostitution activity that's not permitted by the bylaws. So that's about having rovers on the ground, being able to follow up complaints from the community when they come, and then once you've identified that if there is some type of breach, then actually going through the legal processes, which is time consuming and can be expensive. It's the only way to really enforce the bylaws. So generally we work on try to encourage people to change their behaviour by those quiet conversations that are held between the staff and the individuals concerned, and then if that doesn't result in the required changes that we're looking for, then we can go down an avenue and really at some point some direction from elected members about how active you're looking for us to be, or whether and how quickly you want to escalate it through into the legal process as opposed to the more gentler conversations with individuals.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I also understand that with regard to our bylaws that the police are unable to assist.
Yeah, that's a question I think we need to have answered in terms of the committee, because some of our bylaws are enforced by the police. I'm thinking in terms of the Beaches bylaw, some are not, and I think a clarification of what is and what isn't would be of value to members. Yep, thank you. I've got Councillor Stewart next, and then Councillor Robson.
Thank you, through the chair, and regarding the tree policy, and thank you Councillor Baldock for raising it. It is an ongoing issue, and back in the day when Mayor Crosby was here, we were to review trees, and somehow it's just lost its way a bit. But Rebecca Perrott at one stage talked about getting a consent that would manage the pruning of notable trees, so it may be useful if staff could have a look just to see what's happened over the last 3 to 5 years regarding the tree issue, and I'm happy to provide any emails I've got on the topic as well. So it is certainly an issue, and as the trees grow, there's been more problems arising throughout the community, so we need to address how we can efficiently prune the trees and also where the costs lay regarding this.
Your question through the chair to staff, the issue of resourcing has been mentioned. Have we got an indication of what the current financial year budget allocation is for the, if you like, management in the widest sense? The resources we're applying to the management of our policy portfolio, and subsequent the, if you like, enforcement in inverted commas of our policy portfolio. What's the cost to council, i.e. the ratepayer, for the management of our policy portfolio in terms of staff time and overhead and legal advice? What's the budget? And what's the budget for consequently enforcing whatever policies we come up with, or enacting them, or?
Don't have it off the top of my head, but I can get the information to you on both those activities.
I think
Which is not just the councillors, but also the public.
I think at the moment, the way internally we have been structured in the past, strategic thinking and policy is all merged into one. And you'll be aware that there's a reorganisation proposal out at the moment that's seeking to split that, so it's much clearer. And there are individual budgets, and we need to look at how those fit together. So we're just sort of trying to clarify some of those elements.
Thank you. Apologies for lateness. Jeremy, do we talk about having a large number of policies, plans and bylaws? I've just looked on the website, 96 policies, 15 bylaws, 10 plans, 13 strategies, 8 joint strategies and 2 corporate strategies. I think that really, and a partridge in a pear tree, that really speaks to how complex this is. Do we have a list of these that it's readily available and when they need to be reviewed, just so we can make sure we keep track of all of them? There's, jointly there's probably 150 to look after.
Not yet, no. And this initial bit of stock take work here, followed by the prioritisation, and it's going to take a while. A lot of those policies are quite historical. The last time I understand they went through, I haven't been in this world for a number of years now, but the last time I went through those, there was still good reasons to keep some of those things on the statute books. So there was a cull, and we've still got 96 and 15 and 3 and 7 and whatever else you said. But we'll keep looking at that. There is a project we'd like to kick off underway, we'd like to kick off to look at those old ones again and just see if we can rationalise. There's one area in particular, there's about 18 or 19 policies, all of which talk to each other and across each other, and they're relevant in their specific area. If we try to unbundle them and make them into one super policy, what are we losing? Is it right to actually keep it as it is, so there's specific council direction on specific issues regarding A, B, C, or can we wrap that up? Don't know. And sometimes if you wrap things up, you lose the nuance of the council's decisions. Other times you don't, and we just need to make judgment calls on that.
Okay, colleagues, I'm detecting there being no further questions. We have a recommendation on page 54. Now, I acknowledge that we've talked about the tree policy. We can address that on the 7th of May meeting, or we can, if somebody's prepared to move an amendment, we can address it, or not address it, but we can pick it up on the 7th of May. Oh, we will pick it up, Stan? Okay, fantastic. Happy to move. Councillor Robson, is there a seconder for the recommendations? Councillor Malloy, do you wish to speak to the recommendations? Councillor Malloy, do you wish to speak as seconder? Is there any further discussion from colleagues? Councillor Brown?
I just think having a really good understanding of policies and bylaws and plans and why we need them, and we often get criticised in the community like we're just still too, I'm trying to think of a proper word, strict on sticking to policy, but I don't think the community really understands we absolutely have to have framework and policy, or else we don't have any direction, and just the relevance and importance of all of these is really critical.
I shall put the resolution. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? And that is carried. The next item, DC 12, has been withdrawn. There are no late items. Can I please have a mover and seconder that we move into public excluded, because we are to discuss the shared services project. Is there a mover that we go into confidential? Moved by Councillor Brown, seconded by Councillor Robson. Any discussion? I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried.